Welcome everyone to tonight's program, The British Treachery and Israel, brought to you by the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research and presented by Geoffrey Clarfield. I'm Doris Epstein, and I'm speaking to you amidst devastating news from Israel. And I'm also speaking with you about those in our country hostile to Israel who are celebrating the genocidal terror attacks by Hamas. But Jews around the world are rallying. We're strong and we will overcome. Tonight's webinar, though based in part in history, on past history, is vitally linked to what's happening now, today. You will discover facts about the long shadow of the British occupation of Israel and much more. That all of these things that still negatively affect Israel today. First, a word about the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research, which has been a proactive Jewish presence in Canadian Jewish life for over 30 years and is the only academic-based organization of its kind. In addition to our academic and student publications, the CIJR Daily Briefing brings you the latest news and opinions about Israel and the Jewish world, articles that you can always trust for scholarly depth and veracity. We also bring you groundbreaking seminars, books, and symposia. Your support to continue our work. A CIJR is a not-for-profit organization, and our work is entirely dependent on tax-free dollars. First, a big thank you to our community sponsors, the Lodger Shul, the Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights, the Canadian Education and Anti-Semitism Foundation, and End Jewish Hate Canada. Now, I'm very, very pleased to introduce you to Geoffrey Clarfield. Born in Toronto, brought up in Toronto, but a world traveler and doer, anthropologist, journalist, commentator on current events. Not only does he understand what's happening in the world and why, but he's lived it. Morocco, India, Nepal, East Africa, Ethiopia, and of course Israel, where he taught anthropology and played in a Jewish Arab band. Geoffrey, over to you.
Thanks so much, Doris. First of all, I would like to thank the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research for the opportunity to talk to you tonight. The situation in Israel is grim. We are all following the news and commentary from various sources, and I'm sure that as I speak, many of you, like myself, have family and friends in Israel. I salute them and wish them extra courage during these difficult times. The situation on North American and European campuses of higher learning is also grim, as the objective study of the Middle East has been hijacked by Islamic oil countries, who have funded enough Middle East study centers in Canada and the US so that now these institutions are mostly anti-Israel and call for its destruction. I recommend anyone interested in this topic to read the National Association for Scholars, NAS, study called Hijacked by Nitu Arnold, written last year and which can be found on their website. There you will find that oil interests have funded most centers for the study of the Middle East and converted them into academic bastions of anti-Israel sentiment, which you're seeing in public institutions as we speak. And so the need for independent voices such as the CIJR is as important as ever. So whenever Israel is attacked, those of us in the diaspora inevitably feel a combination of anger and hopelessness, helplessness. And we ask ourselves, what can we do? Well, one of the things we can do is to never stop learning and talking. And I think this is one of the great lessons one gains from studying or contemplating the Talmud. We carry on the discussion, we carry on the exploration. Part of that is to examine our own assumptions about Jewish and Israeli history and to see if we can make them more realistic. I will share just one example tonight. Like most of you who have read modern Jewish and Israeli history, we remember that the British Empire was still alive and kicking for a full 2 decades before the winds of change brought about the complete breakup of the British Empire in the 1960s, almost a full generation after World War II. So just before the Suez War broke out in 1956, Britain still had military bases, soldiers, and naval forces in the Gulf, in Oman, in Cyprus, and in semi-independent states like Iraq and Jordan, not to mention the Sudan. Therefore, Israel was still surrounded by hostile Arab countries with well-funded armies and British military bases. And here is what the historians and the histories, both Jewish and non-Jewish, taught me. That after World War II, although Arab nationalism and the power of the Arab League was growing, it was held in check by close interdependency with Britain. Britain gave them guns and money, and the Arab nations gave them oil. Britain had led and financed the Arab Legion, which was managed by active British officers. The Arab Legion in 1948 helped Jordan conquer East Jerusalem and occupy Judea and Samaria. Britain begrudgingly recognized the new state of Israel, exchanged ambassadors, but was clearly on the side of the Arab League. Then, only a few years later, in a last-ditch effort to save the empire and teach the Egyptian nationalists under Nasser a lesson, Britain orchestrated an invasion of the Suez Canal in 1956 and then allowed France and Israel to partner with them for their own cynical gain. The Americans protested, the Israelis left the Sinai, which they had just conquered, the French withdrew, and the Egyptians gained full control over the Suez Canal. The British may have triumphed militarily, but the new world power, America, made them lose politically. From here, it is just a few short years before there was no more British Empire, and scores of newly independent states in Africa and Asia began joining the United Nations. And so it was with interest that in a recent article published in Tablet, and some other articles on the same topic that I read in the left-leaning British newspaper, The Guardian, that I discovered about, or I found out about, unclassified documents, more recently unclassified documents, about the Suez debacle, which mentioned an operation codenamed JOI 27. JOI 27 was a secret military plan of the British under the pretext of acting on its defense pact with Jordan to attack Israel by air and destroy its air force, wipe it out, and send in ground troops to consolidate the destruction of the less than 10-year-old Jewish state. Oh yes, the plans made sure that no holy places would be violated, but sadly, there would be inevitable civilian casualties. As I understand it today, there was no explicit mention in the documents of JOI 27 that Israel as an independent nation would be once again occupied by the British, thereby losing its independence and thus in some way becoming a protectorate once again. Perhaps the British intended to hand Israel over lock, stock, and 2 smoking barrels to the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. What they planned to do with its Jewish citizens is unknown. What I do know from having worked with the British on and off during my life, especially overseas, is that they have a culture where what is left unsaid is the most important thing. That is to say, the military invasion of Israel in 1955, which would be supported by British troops still in Cyprus and the Gulf, would have been a thinly disguised war of conquest. That is to say, in polite terms, a reconquest that could have created a new British mandate or a solution in favor of a puppet regime in Jordan. It didn't turn out that way. Doing some recent searches on the web, I came across an academic article, surprisingly written in 1988, about such a plan, authored by a man named Stuart A. Cohen. It is called A Still Stranger Aspect of Suez Operational Plans to Attack Israel 1955 to 1956, published by the Taylor and Francis Group. I immediately went back to the internet and looked up American-Israeli Daniel Gordis, his latest book on modern Israel called Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn, which he wrote in 2016. I reread the chapter on the Suez War of 56. There is no mention of JOI 27 specifically, and there's no mention of secret British plans to attack Israel. Maybe it's hidden in the index or the footnotes, but I read the chapter again yesterday. It's not there. So let me now briefly summarize, try and clarify this rather dense article by Cohen from 1988 and see if I can make it clear. Then and only then will I draw some tentative conclusions about what this secret deal to destroy Israel may teach us in these present times. The first thing we learn is that during the buildup to the joint British, French, Israeli invasion of Egypt in 1956, General Moshe Dayan himself had got wind somehow that the British, in some strange way, may have had it in for Israel. In his daily diary, he refers to this, and I quote, "Save for the Almighty, only the British are capable of complicating affairs to such a degree. At the very moment when they are preparing to topple Nasser, who is a common enemy of theirs and ours, they insist on getting the Iraqi army involved, even if such action leads to war between Israel and Jordan, which they, the British, will take part against Israel." In fact, 1 year before the Suez operation, which was codenamed Operation Musketeer, the British had a full plan for a full-scale Jordanian and British coordinated attack against Israel. In classic British fashion, the British military planners kept on changing the name of the secret plan, as they probably knew very well that it was easier to keep it secret if the name kept on changing. Historians would have a hard time putting together the knots, and journalists be damned, for they had no access. Even a leak wouldn't have bothered them, as it could be downplayed as just one possible scenario in the defense of a treaty ally, Jordan, a loyal client of the United Kingdom. So let me give you the names for this very clear, very unified project that the British High Command had been working on a mere 7 years after Israel gained its independence. It was first called JOI 27. Then it became Catapult. Then it became Encounter. Then it became Cordage. Then it became Overseer, with subsidiary plans called Quickfire, Alacrity, and Fleetfoot. After seeing all the different and highly poetic euphemisms for a licensed British slaughter of Israeli Jews, I can only imagine a Monty Python skit with actor John Cleese as a crazy general who agonizes over getting the right title for the operation, leaving the real work to be done by his clueless underlings. Unfortunately, there is no real humor here. And 7 years after the British lost the war to almost lost the war to the Nazis, as it is now historically clear that without the Russians and the US, Britain would have lost World War II. They had their own plan to slaughter the Jews after the Nazis were finished, this time in the Holy Land. Well, the British set it up with a full military alliance set out in both public and secret annexes between the United Kingdom and the Kingdom of Jordan. It basically said, this was a treaty, that if the security of Jordan was at risk, Britain would come to its aid with guns, planes, and soldiers, and all would be legal. In 1956, Prime Minister Ben Gurion became the leader of Israel once again after his temporary political exile, and he ordered reprisals for terrorist attacks coming from Gaza, then occupied by Nasser's Egyptians. This caused the British leaders of the Jordanian Arab Legion, particularly John Bagot Glubb, who had fought against Israel in 1948, to say that the Israelis may get desperate and attack Jordan as well. Then the full implementation of the joint defense agreement between Jordan and Britain could be implemented. On the 22nd of April, 1955, with the help of Glubb, the British High Command submitted a preliminary report on how to defend Jordan by attacking Israel. The first stage would be to send more British troops and planes to Jordan and Iraq. For the Royal Air Force, the RAF, to fly near Israel to give it the message. Publicly, Britain would use language that it was trying to prevent war between Jordan and Israel. The British at that time feared that the Israelis may be prepared to attack Jordan at any moment and take back the territories that we know were promised to them in the mandate, namely Judea and Samaria. As Britain had already agreed to lower their presence in the Suez and Egypt, they knew that by then they would no longer be able to threaten Israel from Sinai. So the British also concluded that now that the Israeli Air Force was a force to contend with, if the treaty with Jordan were to be activated, the British could not allow themselves to take a defensive position. They would have to attack the Israelis and destroy their Air Force, and this included the use of ground troops. They then prepared a list of Israeli sites that they would bomb if they were to attack Israel. On August 2nd, 1955, Sir Claude Pelly issued detailed battle plans to the British High Command. The document, of course, is JOI 27. So let us read what he wrote. I quote, "Our first aim will be to destroy the Israeli Air Force, and we shall employ the whole of our available Air Force on this attack until it is accomplished. Damage to civilian property and loss of civilian life is unavoidable. The damage to any other place precludes the safety of the holy places, which must be absolutely safeguarded." Whoa. Surprisingly, the British military establishment thought that the British Air Force may actually fail to destroy the Israeli one. So they developed a series of subsidiary plans, support plans for invasion by ground troops and air squadrons from Europe to Cyprus to the battlefield in Israel, called Operations Quickfire, Alacrity, and Fleetfoot. That's not a rock band. That was an initial British invasion plan for Israel. As Nasser had announced that he, at the same time, may be asking for weapons from the Soviet Union, the British High Command conjured up all sorts of possible Israeli actions against Egypt and Jordan and wanted plans to scuttle all or any of these imagined scenarios. The British High Command kept adding more and more numbers of British arms, troops, and planes to its plan from its European, Near Eastern, and Cypriot bases, which would allow them to succeed in what looked simply like a planned invasion or conquest of Israel. The British wanted, at the same time, military control over Jordan and its forces, but this started getting difficult because of growing pro-Nasser sentiments in both Jordan and the Arab world. And so suddenly, this caused King Hussein in March 1st, 1956, to fire Bagot Glubb, the head of the Arab Legion and the leader of his armed forces, that British officer and advisor to the British High Command. So the British started having doubts about the motivation and ability of the Jordanians to do their part in the joint conquest of Israel. All of a sudden, their Arab allies were getting wobbly. They thought that if the Jordanians do not play ball with them, they could still attack Israel from Cyprus, from its British fleet there and its aircraft carriers. That same year, on the diplomatic front, Britain strengthened its diplomatic and military promises to Jordan, all on the assumption that it would help them in their secret plan to reconquer Israel. As one of the reports put it, the committee agreed that it was important to keep Jordan cooperative, at least until the situation in the Middle East subsequent to the Suez Canal problem being solved was clear. It just sounds so great in that upper-class Oxford middle accent, but they're really crying for Jewish blood. Simply put, this meant keep the alliance with Jordan strong, promise them the moon, invade Egypt, bring Nasser to his knees, and then destroy the Jewish state by waiting for them to respond to the periodic cross-border terrorist attacks from Jordanian territory that had been going on off and on since 1948. Almost at the same time that these plans were being developed, the British cabinet and the British High Command were cooking up their plan to invade Egypt, the one we read about in the history books, destroy Nasser, hopefully, and reassert their power over the Suez Canal as Nasser had nationalized it. This plan never changed its name and was called Operation Musketeer. How charming, all for one and one for all. Whether they named it that because they wanted to go in with the French, the plan finally included the Israelis at the request of the French, as the Israelis were receiving or about to receive Mystère jets from France, as the Americans and the British still refused to sell Israel fighter jets. Throughout the planning and the implementation stages of Musketeer, a never-changing priority was the plan for British bombing of Egyptian airfields in the Suez Canal. This was central to their battle strategy, and they believed that British and French ground troops would and could only intervene when the Egyptians totally lost their air power. The British very much insisted that the French do not sell Israel jets at that time. Musketeer in the early days never allowed for the remote possibility of Israeli participation, but the French soon changed all that. Nevertheless, in secret meetings, Lord Salisbury himself had mildly entertained the idea that Israel may do something to support the French and the British, as Nasser was their common enemy. But at the time, among the British and the High Command and the cabinet, was merely a suggestion. What the British feared during this time was an Israeli attack on Jordan, when France and Britain would be tied up in the Suez trying to make a mess out of Egypt. The British High Command spun many scenarios about what these Israelis might or might not do and what would be the appropriate British response. The British admitted that during Operation Musketeer, that no matter what the Israelis did or do not do, they would tie the hands of the British over Israel and Jordan. So Gerald Templer and his colleagues came to for them a very sad conclusion that Britain could not implement both Musketeer and JOI 27 at the same time. Sadly enough, from their point of view, Musketeer would have to come first, and JOI 27 would be left on the drawing board. Now, the Jordanians did not know that Britain and France were about to invade Egypt, even with or without Israeli support. So when the newly emboldened Israel under Ben-Gurion responded to the latest terror attack from Jordan, which in this case was responded by the Israelis with an attack on the police station at Kalkalia in what was then called the West Bank, the British really wanted to rattle their sabers. King Hussein, feeling that he had the backing of the United Kingdom, naturally demanded that Britain join him in reprisals against the Israelis. Yet he got a big surprise when the British did not consider the Israeli raid an act of war, calmly explaining to the king that a raid was not necessarily a war. Again, it sounds like Monty Python. And so they denied the request for retaliatory help and escalation. As a consolation, the British promised the Jordanians more arms, and with them planned for an eventual attack somewhere down the road, a joint attack against the Israeli port of Eilat, which is the twin city of the Jordanian port of Aqaba. At the same time that all this was going on, the Jordanian street was in an absolute uproar as pro-Nasser and pro-Nasserist sentiments were expanding, leaving King Hussein in a very tight spot. One has to assume that, like King Farouk of Egypt before him, he feared that maybe, perhaps he too could be exiled by his own people, who wouldn't mind a political and military alliance with Egypt and Syria in the name of Arab nationalism. At the same time, some British commanders still argued that they could draw on forces already committed to the invasion of Egypt and Musketeer. And once they were on the ground, sort of turn right, channel them to the JOI 27 initiative. But somehow they lost that argument. The politicians overrode them. This caused the higher-ups to formally separate the two initiatives. Prime Minister Anthony Eden himself wrote about it at this time. It would be contrary to our interest to act at this time and alone in support of Jordan against Israel. Therefore, every possible effort should be made to ensure that Israelis should not at this stage attack Jordan. Well, so France came to the rescue. They understood that Eden was obsessed with Jordan. They may have known something about JOI 27, but the researcher Cohen, in his 1988 article, mentions that some of the British documents from this time have been destroyed. And in 1988, the French and Israeli documents were not open to the public. I doubt that they are now. France could have its cake and eat it too. It could send the not yet independent Algerian Arab nationalists a message by attacking Egypt. It could show the British that the French were once again a world power. It could sell Israel jets and be sure that they would perhaps be deployed in the Egyptian campaign or at later times against common enemies, and that a potential invasion of Israel by Britain and Jordan could be avoided, if not postponed. And so the problem was solved, sort of. Eden would only go in with the Three Musketeers if he was promised that the British imagined Israeli invasion of Jordan would not happen, and the Israelis had to promise British and French that this would not happen. This is how Eden remembers it in his very British, restrained, and upper-class, clearly ambiguous way, which he announced in the House of Commons in 1956. If anyone had been in Tel Aviv at the time, and if they were concerned with what had happened, they would have known that Israel would strike out before she was strangled. Jordan was a possibility upon the list. I do not know what it would have led to. So Ben-Gurion promised not to attack, and the Israelis went into Egypt with the French and the British. They won a phenomenal military victory. The Americans were enraged. They forced everyone to retreat and withdraw. Nasser got the Suez Canal. The British left Egypt, and the Egyptians, Syrians, and Jordanians soon started thinking about their next war against Israel that we all know took place over 6 days in 1967. End of this part of the story. What can we conclude? The answer, I think, is many things, but let me give you my own thoughts. The first is personal. How is it that in my long-term, near-obsessive interest in modern Israeli history, I did not know about JOI 27? In all my years working and living and talking to people in Israel, no one ever mentioned it. Not at the universities, the Technion, not my extended family, nobody. It was never mentioned in the myriad of books and articles that I've read about modern Israel. Remember, Cohen's article came out in 1988. How could I have missed something so important? A planned British invasion of Israel 7 years after its independence. Bothers me. Okay, maybe it's because I'm an ignorant amateur historian, but how is it that the charming and most sincere American Israeli historian Michael Gordis did not mention JOI 27 in the chapter on Suez in his recent book? He's a professional historian and scholar. How is it that in discussions and writings about the betrayal of the League of Nations mandate for Palestine, which led to a British-led attack on the young state by the Arab Legion in 1948, manned by British officers, funded by the British taxpayer, the myth of political British neutrality in 1948 is still upheld by many, many writers, as if the Arab Legion was not a British tool, and as if Glubb Pasha wasn't calling for the blood of Israel and Jews in 1955 and 56. Now, to bring this to the present, we see how at that time the United States refused to sell arms to the young Jewish state because even President Eisenhower and his State Department advisors felt that the Jewish state would not last. Is this not a lesson that although today the United States claims to be Israel's ally and best friend, we must consider that there are very powerful forces in various parts of the US government and the establishment who have scenarios that bring about the disappearance of the Jewish state? For example, let us remember the infamous Obama appointee, Samantha Powers, who once argued that the US should send troops to Israel to protect the Palestinians. Is this perhaps the vision that Obama and his supporters, including the recent $6 billion hostage ransom deal that Biden has promised the Iranians, have been doing by strengthening Iran and its proxies to the point that Israel may be unable to defend itself? I will not answer these questions as they are thought experiments. They're thought experiments, and I'm asking you to consider them. So thank you so much for listening to this presentation, and I once again thank CIJR for giving me the opportunity to share this material with you this evening. Bye.
Geoffrey, I don't know whether to thank you or to yell at you for this shocking, to me, shocking revelation of Britain. And the good question is, well, how come we don't know about this? Why is it such a hidden thing? Or is it hidden? Is it deliberately hidden?
Am I supposed to answer?
Yeah. Yes, please.
It's not deliberately hidden. You know, I already did my slichus tonight by saying, my God, this article has been around since 1988. How did I miss it? How did we miss it? Why is it sitting there on the margins and not in the center?
Right.
And I think it has something to do with Jewish psychology, is whenever we get a partial ally or an ally, we've been so long that we idealize them. Oh my God, we have an Israeli embassy in London. We've arrived. President Biden says that Israel's its best ally. And there's something naive and hopeful in the Jewish soul, something good, but which allows us to very often believe what we want to believe, as opposed to looking at politics in the real light of history. Jews are an optimistic people. We are optimistic right now, even though we're under fire in a terrible attack. We choose life, as it says in the Bible. And this, as Freud says, can get in the way of the reality principle. So I find this stuff extremely distasteful, but I feel
it has to be known.
It has to be known, and I
go
feel
further, there's several questions about what does JOL 27 stands for. One person said it's Jews out of Israel. Bad
I'll
joke.
take that.
Bad.
I've only seen the secondary literature because I'm not a professional historian in the old sense. I have often, because the internet allows you to do so, looked at original documents. But I don't know. I think it would be Joint Operation Initiative or something like that. This goes back to British culture. The British, on the one hand, are famous for logical positivism and excellence in language, but at the political level, they're the absolute masters of obfuscation and ambiguity. So it probably stands for something like Joint Operative Initiative, Joint Ointment, or something, something completely unreadable. And the fact that they kept on changing its names, there's something devilishly funny about that.
Very fishy. I want to go back to Britain's first treachery. And I'm talking about the League of Nations mandate when they carved up the Ottoman Empire, and various nations were allotted certain countries a mandate to govern and to make them autonomous. Britain was given the land of Palestine, twice as much as we have today, because, and you finish it.
Well, the British were not acting in good faith. A small number of men and a few women who understood history realized that they and other Christian nations had treated the Jews abominably, and that it was time for the Jews, as Bibi says, to take their stand in the sun. And the structure of the mandate is beautiful. If you read the document, it's actually still legally viable today, I've been told by international lawyers.
It is legally viable today.
It is, but there's a beautiful book called The Rape of Palestine, which by, I don't remember his name, an American who was a Jabotinsky supporter and systematically showed how the entire bureaucratic structure of the mandate, from Whitehall to the British officer in Tel Aviv, was designed to destroy it. So that period from 1920 to 1948 was just not a neutral period. And again, I'm upset because you read Benny Morris's book, One Palestine Complete, and it makes it look like the British were playing cricket. Well, there's the Jews on one side and the Arabs on one side. You know, buddy, we're just trying to play a decent game here. And it wasn't the case. It was a systematic, comprehensive desire to negate the mandate. And there are historical sources out there. But again, Benny Morris, he's a new historian. He wants the world to be a nicer place than it is. Again, I'm going to repeat myself because Jewish psychology is such that we're optimistic and we look at the brighter side. But we also have to be extremely realistic and self-psychoanalytic to be able to manage the structure of hatred and how history has been subtly rewritten by new historians in Israel, sad bunch, and the left, that, the mandate for Palestine, was this thing that the British did to support the Jews. There's no evidence.
And encourage the return of Jews to their ancient homeland, I'm quoting.
Yes.
But what did they do? They gave half of it to the Hashemites, which is now Jordan.
Well, the fictitious kingdom of Jordan. Jordan is a joke. The majority of people in Jordan identify as Palestinians, and they always say Jordan is Palestine, Palestine and Jordan. The Jordanian leaders are a bunch of Bedouin that the British brought from Arabia, and they were supported by Lawrence of Arabia. And a journalist went to Jordan in the 50s and said, "Do you remember this guy, Lawrence?" And they said, "Oh yeah, the guy with the gold." I think for every soldier that fought with Lawrence, the British gave, a bar of gold. And for every Jewish soldier that fought with George Henry Patterson in the Jewish Legion, I think they got about a shilling a day. The return on investment for the British from the Jewish Legion in securing Palestine, Eretz Israel, for the mandate was much higher than the Bedouin. But hey, we don't have a film called Lawrence of Arabia. We're at a distinct disadvantage.
But why? I want you to pinpoint why they did that, why they betrayed their mandate and gave that land to half the country.
The anthropological analysis of this is there was a movement called philo-Semitism of British intellectuals from the working, the middle, and the upper classes who were historically informed and felt badly that as Christians, they had treated Jews and the Jewish people so horribly. And so they saw it as reasonable and rational to give the Jews back their country. But they were overwhelmed by the traditional medieval anti-Semites who believed that the Jews are homeless because they killed Christ and they rejected the Christian message. And unfortunately, from a psychological, theological point of view, that medieval worldview was stronger than the Philo-Semitic worldview. The Philo-Semites opened the door and gave the Jews the opportunity to create a state against great opposition.
Okay, we'll jump to today and Biden's visit to Israel. Can we trust that America is going to come through for us? Does Biden really, is he going to stand by his words? And why is he visiting Israel himself?
It's a great question. I think the lesson that we can draw from this experience is that there is a deep need for Jews to project a savior. And we want the Americans to be our friends. We want them to back us up because America is an exceptional nation whose constitution is fundamentally influenced by the Old Testament. There's no Jesus in the Declaration of Independence. There's no New Testament in the Constitution, but there's a whole lot of talk about God. And scholars will confirm this, that the founding fathers were very much influenced and inspired by the ethics and the political organization of ancient Israel to reconstitute the state. Similarly, if I can follow that Freudian line, Israel and its rise are exceptional. They're exceptional nations. There's wonderful things to be said about the United States, but there's a lot of other forces in the United States, just like there were in Britain, far more than we realize. 75% of American Jews vote Democrat. They don't vote Republican. 90% of Jewish intellectuals are on the left. They're always bashing Israel. And I don't think we can trust President Biden because eminent historians and American pundits like Victor Davis Hanson strongly suggest that he's taking, if not orders, but his cues from Obama, that Biden does not speak for himself. So Obama was very good at going out in public and saying, we love the Jews, we support Israel, blah, 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 and then tilt this realignment to Iran. If Israel was really a friend, if America was really a friend of Israel, they'd go in and use this as a reason to make Iran a peaceful country, if I can say it euphemistically, like the British. But they won't, and they're not. So Israelis have to be very careful what the Americans say and what they do, and we have to be very skeptical in what the Americans are saying to the Israelis, what you can't do. And so this is very frightening. If you listen to the Hebrew press and the Hebrew punditry, which I listen to a lot, there's a lot of discussion about how can we get out of the Americans' hands? Why are we so dependent? And is it possible in a multipolar world where Israel is a strong economy and has its own arms industry to distance itself from the United States? That's one of the conversations which I've been listening to every day. I find it encouraging.
What about relations with UK today? And did they improve, and when?
Well, the United Kingdom has changed. When you look at the pictures in the slideshow and you see all these old upper class Eton generals and naval commanders and stuff like that, they had a horrible worldview. Think of them as Downton Abbey with anti-Semitism. Surprisingly, there's no anti-Semitism in Downton Abbey. That's why it's a myth. That's why it's a fairy tale. But oh my God, those periods in the 30s, the upper classes and the royals of the British were gung-ho Hitler. So United Kingdom has changed a little. The left is now the great anti-Zionist movement, and the conservatives are a little less anti-Zionist, and some of them are actually accepting Israel as a fait accompli. A small minority of them are pro-Israel. I think the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, and this is just my personal impression, of Britain, is probably sincerely more pro-Israel than Joe Biden. But again, this is punditry. I really don't have the depth of understanding and the sources to be able to make those comments. I'm just giving you my first impression. Israel has to watch out.
This is not
Israel has to
exactly
be
on
careful.
topic, but it's relevant because we're living it today. When ISIS appeared to be a world threat, global threat with its evil, Hamas is worse, killing more people, taking more hostages, and the world rallied. Every country, every Western country came out to beat ISIS. Who's coming out to help us now?
Well, that's a great question because
who can we rely on?
Sorry?
Who can we rely on? Who can we trust?
This is a deep thing, is that nations don't have friends and they don't have allies. They only have common interests. And Israelis have to learn to be like the French and the British and the Americans. They should learn to be feared and respected. Again, it's part of the Jewish culture to want to be loved, because we're a loving culture. What we get in the jihadi movements is alphabet soup. One day it's Hamas, another day it's Al-Qaeda, another day it's ISIS, another day it's Taliban. And let me tell you, from my research on the Yazidi, is the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, when it was really strong, had 60,000 fighters from across the Islamic world. It wasn't just a bunch of local Kurds and Arabs. It was a pan-Islamic movement. Hamas may be local Arabs of Gaza or Arabs of the land of Israel, but it's also an international jihadi movement. And I think Jews and Israelis have to work harder at explaining to non-Jews that what we're dealing with is a pan-Islamic jihad. It just has different faces. What Hamas wants
Would
to
you
do.
elaborate
Sorry?
on that a pan-Islamic jihad? Did you
Well,
elaborate on that?
yeah, I can try and say it anthropologically. The great pre-industrial, non-industrial, agricultural civilizations of the world, China, India, and the Islamic countries, all became modernized. Some through war, some through colonization. They were exposed to French, Portuguese, Dutch, English ways of doing things, Americans, the Philippines. And as independent countries, they had to try and cut it with a division between church and state and rule of law. Most of the Islamic states have reverted to kleptocracies, dictatorships, but highly infused with the medieval Sharia consensus of jihadi Islam. And they help each other all the time. And we have to diagnose that and to share it much more widely because it's not just local. As you point out very wisely, Hamas is not just local, it's part of an international jihadi movement. And so again, we have to be realistic. Jews and friends of Israel, and we have more friends than we had in the past. When I grew up in Canada in the 50s and 60s, when Israel was attacked, there wasn't one church member, there wasn't one church, there wasn't one politician or one institution that stood with Israel and the Jews. That's changed. We still have more enemies than friends, but we have more friends than we had in the past, and we have to listen to them. And many of them are saying, highlight jihad, because that's what this is. If you're fluent in Hebrew and you go to Israel and you listen to the way the Israeli press describes terrorist institute, they say, sadly, 2 people were killed and 3 injured in a terrorist attack in the town of so-and-so for sibot le'umiyot, nationalist reasons, where the actual perpetrators were said, no, man, we were doing jihad. We weren't doing it for nationalist reasons. So the notion of Palestinian nationalism is really, really something that Hamas has its own Singapore on the Mediterranean. What's it doing attacking Israel? This is jihad under a different name. And our job in Israel and outside is to label things correctly, to make a background. This thing about JOI 27 and our understanding of Suez, I feel that I had a real misunderstanding. Just because the British were planning to destroy Israel and couldn't, doesn't mean it should be wiped clean from our historical conscience. Just because there has been a jihad against the Jews for 1,300 years doesn't mean we should make excuses for it.
Question, is Israel still dependent on the US today? And how well can Israel hold up against Russia and China's hostility? So first question is, is she actually...
Excellent question. There are experts, men and women better read than I in political science and history, who say that the 21st century will no longer be the American century. The 20th century was the American century, that the 21st century is a multipolar world. India, the Far East, Russia, the Islamic states, Western Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa. And to put it simply, Israel has to craft a foreign policy that's multilateral. They may have to say for the next 10 years that America is our best friend and it's a special relationship. But there's even an argument going on in Israel right now about Biden saying, we'll give you as many arms as you need. And some people like Carolyn Glicker are saying, no, we'd rather buy them. Because if we get them for free, we pay a price politically. So an ability of Israelis to stop taking the special relationship with the United States as the rock bottom of their foreign and military policy is a very good start. It's a very frightening thing because it's called breaking free and growing up.
You've lived in most of the countries that we're talking about, and majority Muslim.
Yeah.
How united are they in terms of supporting each other? So far,
Oh,
they're cheering Hamas. So far, I hear a lot of cheering of Hamas. But are they united together? Or
no, no. They're united in the Islamists, who are the majority in the Muslim and Arab world, contrary to what other people think. Not everyone's an Islamist in the Arab and Muslim world, but the majority are. And this has been studied and done by surveys. So they're united in their hatred of the Jews and Israel and the West. They talk about the little Satan and the big
are we
Satan.
lumped into
I always
Israel?
joke.
The West is
Sorry?
lumped. The West is lumped in.
Oh yeah. When you look at how Muslim jihadis think of the world, they have the little Satan, which is Israel, and the big Satan, which is America. But if you study intra-Muslim conflict in the Islamic world, there's just war everywhere. There's enormous conflict
Among
and
themselves.
slaughter. Yeah, yeah, Kurds, Arabs, Berbers, Moroccans, Turks, terrible stuff. Pakistan, India. So they're united in hatred, but in practicality, they're at each other's throats a lot. They haven't been able to pull off. Sure, they have the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC, but it was Bernard Lewis, late great historian of Islam, who wrote a book called What Went Wrong or What Is to Be Done, that basically said most Muslim countries can't modernize. You'll meet a number of modernized Muslims who feel, act, and speak like Brits or Americans or Israelis, but they're the minority. The culture is not doing well. India, for example, they're Indians and they're modern. And I've worked and lived in Nepal and India, and it's a remarkable thing. Chinese as well. Chinese are modern, and Chinese and Confucian. Let's put aside the Communist Party of China, because I suspect they don't have the 100% support of their citizens. That's the best I can do, standing on one leg, as the rabbis say.
Final question. Everybody knows Iran is behind Hamas, that they're puppets, Hezbollah. How and does that threaten the world in a way that this conflict could spread beyond Israel and inflame Iran to push the button?
I'll come at it from a different angle, in that Iran is a rogue nation. It's a jihadi nation. It doesn't matter whether they're Shia or Sunni. They support Sunni jihadis, and they support. Iran is a rogue nation. Anyone who follows the news and a bit of history knows that. They support equal opportunity jihad whenever they can. And the Biden administration and the Obama administration has been appeasing Iran the way the British and the Europeans were appeasing Adolf Hitler. There's certain writers that believe that the Iranian version, their latest version of pan-Islamic jihad, may be strongly influenced by Nazi prototypes. Instead, for the last 10, 12 years, under Obama and under Biden, the establishment in Washington is trying to have a realignment of the Middle East by downplaying the Saudis and downplaying the Israelis and helping Iran. They have all these negotiations. This reminds me of that period of 1936 to 1939, when Britain and Western Europe were constantly trying to appease Adolf Hitler. It rhymes. It's not the same thing, as Mark Twain says. History doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. Even when the coalition of the willing went into Iraq against Saddam Hussein, they probably should have taken on Iran and not Iraq. So Iran has many, many friends in the United States. And to bring this lecture full circle, I pointed out that most of the Middle Eastern and Islamic studies departments in Canada and the States are highly funded by the Saudis and the Iranians. So, they have done elite capture.
That's a topic for another time, the effect on the academic.
It certainly is.
And the trickle down in our culture to make people hostile and believe the lies, the propaganda. Geoffrey,
yes.
on behalf of the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research, I thank you for opening our eyes, even though it was hard to take. We have to know we can't
Unpleasant.
turn our heads away today more than ever. So a big thank you from us, and may we meet next time in better times. May Israel be at peace and the world. Bye for now.
Thank you very much, Doris. It's an honor and a privilege to work with you. Good night.
Thanks.